You can make slippers like these booties in any size whatsoever. Here's another look at the design and how it turns out. First, while I cast on using double E-wrap, let me tell you about the history of this pattern. This one is the baby size, the smallest size, using a number 5 yarn. That's a bulky yarn in the U.S. Europeans would normally knit such a yarn with about a 6 millimeter knitting needle, possibly 5.5, because many times Europeans knit a little more tightly than Americans. I think it would be 10 to 12 ply using the ply system, but in the U.S. we call it number 5. So we're casting on 27 for this size. I'm going to show you this on this loom, which is the Kiss regular gauge loom without any washers. And don't get confused. No washers where I'm knitting. Over here, where I'm not actually using the space, there are some washers in place from my last project, but I don't need those pegs, so I'm not using that part of the loom, and they don't count. My friend Tom Swindler, who we all call the Sockinator because of his passion and excellence in sock knitting, introduced me to this type of slippers. It's a method that's been handed down for generations, and we don't really know the roots of it. So what I'm doing here is making it workable for loom knitters. The original method involved more garter stitch than I'm employing. And that's just because garter stitch is certainly doable on a loom, but it is more tedious, and I thought I'd see, could we manage with more stockinette and less garter stitch, and indeed we can. It works out very nicely. So that's what I am doing with you. The double E-wrap is a perfectly good cast on for this, though you may use any you want. And I believe I have cast on 26 after this, and I only have 1 to go, but it's always smart to count and recount, so we will. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 2, 4, 6, 7. So this loom is cast on. This is a Cindwood loom. It's the 5/8 gauge. And I'm using a thicker yarn on it because that's appropriate to its gauge. So we're going to do the same thing, but cast on fewer stitches. There's my beginning peg. Hang the slip knot on that, and we will cast on 21, including that one. Double E-wrap works fine for this one too. We'll get these 21 stitches cast on, and then we will look at the rows that make the bulk of the pattern. Rows 1 and 2, which will repeat several times. The first part of the pattern consists of 2 rows that get repeated several times, different numbers of times depending on how large a slipper you're making. For this size, we knit 3. And notice I did not slip stitch 1, I did knit it. For Kiss, you just wrap it and knit it. Purl 1. Now we'll knit 19. And for a Kiss, I like to wrap all 19 and then knit them over. So I'll be going all the way around. There should be 4 left at the end of my last knit stitch. Then we purl 1, and knit the last 3. Now I just need to get all of these knit stitches that are wrapped knitted over. And look how fast this technique is. Only kidding. I sped up the film here, but it is pretty fast. Okay, we're ready for row 1. On a standard kind of loom like a Cindwood, that's how I'm doing the end stitches so they knit off neatly. Pinch, twist, hang it. And now it's easy to knit over. That's called a half hitch, and it makes a nicer knit stitch at the edge than just trying to wrap where you've already knitted. It can be done, but that's the way I like to do it. So we're going to knit 3, including that end one, and purl 1. Remember, this is row 1 of a 2-row sequence. And the other end is going to end in purl 1, knit 3. So that'll be knit 3, 1, 2, 3, and purl 1. I'm making up the numbers for this gauge as I go along. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So we're going to knit 13 on row 1 of the 2-row sequence. Knitting normally all the way around the loom until we get to the last 4 stitches, which will involve another purl. Those are 13 knits. Purl 1. And knit 3. Row 2, we're going to knit 7. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now purl 1. Then knit 5. That's 4, 5. Let me get myself untangled. Purl 1. And there should be 7 more to knit. So we'll do that. This will complete row 2 for the Cindwood version. Next we will look at row 2 for the Kiss version. Remember to wrap and knit the first stitch, and we knit 10. That was 8, 9, 10. And with the Kiss loom, I can just wrap all the normal knit stitches, knit the purls as interruptions, sort of, because they're anchoring those knit stitches, and then I can come back and knit them over all at once. For me, that's faster. 5 knit stitches, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a purl. And there should be 10 stitches left, which will be all knit stitches. That was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now I can knit them over. I'm now in the middle of knitting my next row 1. Then I'll knit back with row 2. And for this loom and gauge and size of slipper, I'm going to do that until 12 rows in total have been knitted. Just a quick review. Row 1 on this loom was knit 3, purl 1, knit 19, purl 1, knit 3. On the Cindwood, we do the same thing with the repetition of the numbers 1 and 2 rows. Knit 3, purl 1 for my number 1 row, then knit 13, purl 1, and knit 3. But because this is a larger gauge, instead of doing it until 12 rows have been completed, we will go for 9 rows. So I'm going off camera to do both of those things, and we'll get together for the next step. But before I go, let me remind you, your row count might be very different, as might your stitch count, if you were making them for another size. What I'm doing is walking you through baby slipper sizes, basically booties. Once you get to doing them for yourself, your 4-year-old, your husband, you will be working with different stitch and row counts, but every step will be handled in the same manner. Our 9 rows of the 1-2 pattern are completed. We finished with a row 1. So now we're going to start this row by binding off 3 stitches. I'm doing the transfer bind off. Now, we're going to continue as though knitting a normal row 2. So that was stitch 1, 2, 3. 4, 5, 6, 7 should all be knit stitches, right? Continuing the row 2 pattern, a purl, followed by 5 knits, here, whoops, do get the whole stitch, a purl, and then finish with 7 knits. Now we begin the next row by binding off 3 stitches. Move 1 to the next peg, wrap and knit over, and repeat. Having done that, we have 15 stitches left, and we'll continue on those. We'll finish out this row as though it was a number 1, because it is a number 1 row, but we've already accounted for those knit 3. So this would be a purl stitch. In every pattern size, there is an odd number of stitches, as in 17, 19, 21. instead of 18, 20, 22. Whoops. No, I was doing the right thing. We knit one, purl one around, and because it's an odd number, we will always begin and end on a knit stitch, which will make it easy when we go to seam the toe. So for this size, I'm going to knit 5 knit one, purl one rows. Each of them will begin with a knit stitch, and that will keep the pattern the same. Using ribbing here makes a super simple way to get the toe to assume a toe-like shape without anything fancy in terms of decreasing stitches. That was a knit, ready for a purl. Knit, purl. And remember at the beginning of each one of these rows to do the half hitch so you get a nice, neat knit stitch that's not overly tight. That will make seaming look better and be easier to accomplish. Another way to think of this is that once you have established which are knit stitches and which are purl stitches, that stays the case for the remainder of the project. So there's my half hitch, knit, purl, and on around going the other way for 5 rows in this gauge and size. All the rows for the first sequence are complete, and in this beige color it's easier to look down in and see the effect that those intermittent purl stitches are going to have. They're making ridges that will define the sole of the foot and where the cuff turns out. There's a cuff ridge, sole ridges, cuff ridge. Now we're ready to do the binding off of the front of the cuff area. For this one, it's bind off 4. 1, 2, 3, now this 4th stitch would have been the purl stitch. So there won't be a purl stitch this row on this side, but we'll knit around and we will put the purl stitch in pattern because we're knitting another row 1. It's just that we began it by binding off 4. This one's a purl. The last 3 are knits. I'll just lock this in place and then knit them all over. For every size and gauge, 2 rows begin by binding off a few stitches. So we have completed the first. We also begin this next row by binding off 4. That's 1. 2. 3. And after I have bound off 4 on each side, that's a total of 8. I began with 27. So I should have 19 stitches. Not a terrible idea to count and see if that is in fact the case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and whoops, there's 19. I transferred it while running my mouth instead of counting, so always good to count. Now, these 4 have been accounted for. If you remember, we knitted 10 knits at the beginning of a row 2, and this is a row 2. So we'll knit 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then the purl stitch, five, 6, 7, 8, 9, one more, 10, purl. We want the bottom of the sole to get that shape developed. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 knits. I'm going to go ahead and knit my work, not knit my next purl, work my next purl, because it will nicely anchor my knits for me to knit them over. And the remainder on this side are knit stitches. And this completes section 1 when we get these knitted over. Then, just like the other slipper, we will knit 1 purl one all the way to the toe. For this size and gauge, we only need 6 rows of knit 1 purl one. And remember, as I mentioned while knitting the multicolored one, every row begins with a knit stitch, so it's very easy to remember. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, always ending in a knit and beginning in a knit. So I will do my 6 rows, and then we will get back together. But one thing before I go, I have just gathered this toe for these sizes. This is so few stitches. The adult pattern involves a knit 2 together across the toe. So I will give you a separate demonstration of that on just a scrap piece of knitting as soon as we finish this slipper. It really isn't necessary in these teeny weeny sizes. But when you have 2, 3, and 4 times as many stitches, it makes for a neater toe. So here is our slipper with the knitting complete. We're going to leave a good yarn tail because I like to use the same tail for seaming. Snip it and weave the end, thread the end into a yarn needle of some sort. Now, starting at the end where the tail is, lift the stitches off in order. That first one will enlarge as you pick it up, but that's not a problem. We'll snug it up later. Doesn't matter where in the stitch you find it most convenient to pick up. It'll work fine any old way. Here we are ready to bind off the one that's made on a kiss loom in number 5 yarn, lifting off the stitches in order. And here's what you have. Doesn't look much like a slipper yet, I know. But here's our yarn tail. Gather it in tightly, and you can begin to see it take shape. I'm going to stitch across. Stitch into there and actually knot it. That is the yarn. That finishes closing the toe. You can see it take shape from here. Now you can seam this top of the foot together any way that you want to. For demonstration, I'm going to overcast the edges together. There are so few stitches that it doesn't make an enormous amount of difference. Well, so few rows, really. But use the one you like. In a bulky yarn such as this, I do prefer a method that doesn't use up a stitch in the seam, because that makes such a bulky seam. For some other gauges, I find that entirely acceptable. But for this, I don't. But it's your call. They're your slippers. And now you can really begin to see the slipper take shape. Personally, I like to knot the yarn here, but not cut it. Here's our foot shape forming. This will be the back of the heel. Cuff, where my fingers are holding down. And see where those purl stitches along the sole produced a shaped sole? Tricky, huh? Toe shaping by means of ribbing. But see how that wants to pull apart? There's plenty of room normally in the opening we've allowed to stick the foot in. And I like to reinforce that with a knot. So that part's done. But we don't have to cut it because we can slide the yarn through this area that was also, whoops, you can't see. These were purl stitches. And if I slide this yarn through the back of them, it won't show from the outside. And this gets me over to the heel seam without having an extra knot, which I find to be valuable, again, with such a bulky yarn. You may seam the heel as you wish, but I will tell you what I've experimented with so far. I like my heel seamed behind the cast on. There's my doubly wrapped cast on. So I'll be putting my needle into these openings. And if you've noticed, the cuff flips out with the knit side out, though the rest of the exterior in this shoe area is purl. The knit side is the right side of the cuff, so seam with that in mind so that the seam will be hidden under the cuff. Then push your needle through, turn the slipper inside out, and seam so that the right side is the purl side for most of the back of the foot. I used straight stitches behind the cast on, going one direction and then straight stitched back because of the bulk of this fabric. But any seam that is neat and works for you is perfectly acceptable. Here's the other slipper. Draw in the toe, seam the top of the foot, seam the back of the heel. Okay, let us look at the refinement that involves knit two together across the end. This is not a whole slipper. It's just a piece of ribbing so we can pretend we're ready to bind off the toe. In this application, not in all, knit two together simply means transfer stitch 1 to peg 2, knit them off. There we go. Now stitch 2 to peg 3 and also move the newly knitted stitch next to them to the nearest needle. Wrap, knit off both at once. It doesn't matter if you do it literally at once. See, this time I did one loop, the second loop. If that's easier, do that. Move the next loop over. The thing is, we want these stitches side by side still. And we don't want the size of the stitches to grow from being stretched out. That's why we're moving them together. Next pair of stitches, stack one on top of the other. Move everything over. Tighten up where that tended to grow from me fiddling with it. Wrap, lift, stack up the next pair. Now actually, I can keep moving this direction, but when it gets to be more stitches, the effect is identical if you move the smaller number in, and I dropped one, so let's get that back right. It does need to be that the one, if you've been leaving the left one on the bottom and the right one on the top, you should continue doing so. Other than that, it does not matter whether you move them together from the left or from the right. Now, we don't really have a stitch to pair with this one in my sample. That's okay. We'll just knit it over. That might happen in real life too. Now we'll snip the yarn just as always and lift these off and gather. And there's the gathered toe. And it does reduce bulk because we have half the number of stitches. Now be aware that it's going to look a little different from the other side because these were all knit stitches, leaving the purl bump. The purl side of the first section ends up being the right side of the fabric, which affects the toe. And if you did not want this purl bump, all you have to do is purl two together rather than knit two together. So where we were transferring 1 to 2 and I knitted them off, I could have purled them off. All seamed, let's turn it right side out. There's my yarn tail, and I have not yet clipped it because I have a decision to make, and it's entirely a personal call. Shall I just weave the tail in, making sure we're all tightly seamed, which we seem to be, or shall I stitch down the cuff? And either way looks very nice. The multicolored one we just made is not stitched down. This one is stitched down. Hardly any difference, really, but in some yarns it may behave a little bit differently, and that's something you can decide.